Hi, this is Thomas from Apex Game Tools. In this video we're going to be looking at the grid component with regards to sizing and positioning, and we'll also be taking a look at the grid visualizer. Now, as you can see, we have a rather basic scene with some ground, and we have our grid here in the middle. The grid, right now, it resides on the game world. When you create a game world, it will come with a grid by default. This is not to say that the grid component needs to be in the game world. Grids can be all over in your scene. You decide yourself where you want to put them. But in this case, we're just going to go with the grid component that we have in our game world. Now, before we get to the positioning and sizing of the grid, I'm just going to cover this friendly name property. This property allows you to give your component, well, a friendly name, which you can then use to refer to it. Well, mainly when you do debugging, you will be able to discern one grid from another from its name, and also the designer sometimes will be giving you back messages through the console where it will refer to one grid or another, and it will be using this friendly name in those messages. So this is simply to help you know what grid is being talked about. So let's move on to the positioning and the sizing. So first, positioning of the grid. Right now the grid is linked to its transform. As you can see, this first property here says link origin to transform. This means that it is linked to the transform of its parent game object, which is the game world in this case. So it is now positioned at 0.0.0. And if you want to override that, what you simply have to do is just uncheck this, and then you can write in your own center where you want your grid to be centered. So if you want it offset 5 in positive x, then I can simply enter 5 here, and then my grid will then be offset 5 to the right. Now I'm just going to put it back into the center, which is probably what you want in most cases. So next on, we are going to look at the sizing of the grid. Now, the grid is comprised of these small squares, which we call cells, and each cell has, in this case, a size of 2 by 2. Each side has a length of 2. So cell size is 2, which means it is a 2 by 2 cell. So these settings controlling the size is actually how many squares you want across the x-axis and how many squares or cells you want across the z-axis. In this case, we have the ground, which is 32 by 32. So if we want to cover the whole ground, I'm going to go up to 16 by 16, and we will have the whole grid, or the whole ground covered by the grid. So that's it for setting up the grid with position and size. Now we're just going to take a quick look at the visualizer. Now, the grid visualizer down here is a debugging tool that will let you see how the grid is, where it is at, how many cells there are, and how your level geometry is aligned with these cells or not aligned with the cells, which will let you build your level easier. Now, as you can see, if I turn it off, you can see there's no visuals at all. So the grid component in itself has no visuals at all. It will need this visualizer in order for you to see the grid. So this grid visualizer has some settings that we're just going to cover some of them now, and some of them in later videos. Now, the draw always is pretty self-explanatory. If I uncheck this, it will only draw itself if I have the object, game object on which it is defined, selected. Otherwise, it will draw always. Next up, draw mode, layout mode. This is what we're in now. Layout mode is where the grid draws its cells like this, which allows you to place your geometry where you want it, so that it aligns well with the grid. There's another option which is called Accessibility, and we'll get back to that when we look at some of the other options of the grid in later videos. The same goes for subsections. We'll get back to that when we cover subsections. Then we have Draw All Grids. This option, instead of just drawing grids on the same game object where the visualizer is at, if you check this, it will draw all grids in the scene regardless of where they are. So if you just want one visualizer to draw all the grids, then you simply just make one of these. It will be on the game world by default, and then you just check the draw all grids, and you only have one visualizer. That will probably be easier if you want to clean up for production. Now we have an editor refresh interval. This is the interval between each refreshes of the grid if changes were made to the grid. As you might have noticed just before, when we changed the link to origin transform, when I did the change, it didn't happen just straight away. There was a small delay, and this is because the grid needs to be regenerated each time we have such changes, and this is the refresh interval, and this is covered here. So you can set this to a higher or lower value in order to update the grid more or less frequently. And finally, there are some colors that will be defining how the visualizer draws the different representations. So that was it for the basic setup of positioning and sizing and the grid visualizer.